The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting an orange glow over the small village nestled in its valley. You could almost feel the weight of the world on the village's shoulders, a world that had ignored them for far too long. In this remote part of the world, change was something people whispered about but never truly believed could happen. Until she came along. Her name was Mira, and to the people in this village, she was just another quiet, unassuming woman who grew up working the fields. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Mira was about to set in motion a change so profound that it would alter the course of their entire village forever. It all started on a day like any other. Mira was standing in the marketplace just a few steps away from her usual spot. The air was thick with the scent of fresh produce, the chatter of vendors haggling, and the sounds of children laughing as they ran between the stalls. The market was the heart of the village, where everything happened. But on that day, Mira noticed something that had always been there, but somehow never caught her attention before, the way the men spoke to the women. It wasn't the loud, aggressive words, but the dismissive tone, the way they treated the women like they were invisible unless they were serving. It was in the way the women carried themselves, their eyes cast down, shoulders slumped, as if they had been conditioned to stay out of the way. Mira felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Anger. Not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever silently endured this. But Mira wasn't the kind of person to confront others head-on. She wasn't the loud protester, the one who would take the streets and demand answers. She was the kind of person who quietly observed, who would wait for the right moment, the right words to say. She'd always been the observer, never the one in the spotlight. Still that evening, as she sat in her small home, something inside of her shifted. She couldn't let it go. The injustice she saw in the market felt too loud to ignore. Something deep inside her knew that if she didn't act, nothing would ever change. It started small, like most revolutions do. Mira began to speak with the other women in the village, older women who had lived through decades of silence, younger women who were still too afraid to speak out. And one by one they began to talk. It wasn't much at first, just whispers behind closed doors, little conversations as they washed clothes or gathered water. But in those words there was a quiet power building, like a storm that was starting to gather on the horizon. Then came the first spark, the catalyst that would change everything. It was a routine day at the well, a place where the women would come together each morning to collect water. The air was thick with the humidity of early morning, and the sound of the water splashing against the stones echoed through the village. Mira was there, as always, drawing water with the other women. But this time, the conversation turned. It wasn't about the usual mundane things. No, this time it was different. One of the older women, a figure who had seen it all, spoke up. Her name was Amina, and her voice was gravelly with age. But there was something different in the way she spoke that day. "Why do we let them treat us like this?" she asked, her words slow but filled with conviction. "Why do we allow ourselves to be invisible?" Mira had heard these words before, but they didn't feel like whispers anymore. There was something in Amina's voice that made the room go still. The women around her stopped what they were doing, and for the first time in years, the air felt charged. Amina's words were the match, and Mira's heart was the tinder. Mira didn't have the answers, she didn't have a plan, but she knew this. Something had to change, and if it didn't happen now, it would never happen. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet conversations and secret meetings. Mira began to organize small gatherings at night where the women could talk freely. They spoke of dreams, dreams that seemed impossible in their village. They talked about equal rights, about education for their daughters, about the right to choose their own futures. It was dangerous talk, forbidden in many ways, but each conversation felt like an act of defiance against the years of silence they had lived through. And soon something unexpected happened. Other people began to listen. At first, it was just a handful of curious villagers, mostly men, who started to notice the change. They saw the women coming together more often, their heads held a little higher, their voices just a little louder. Some of them dismissed it, thinking it was just idle chatter. But there were others, people who had seen the quiet desperation of their wives and daughters, who started to question things themselves. Could this quiet woman, Mira, really be the spark for something bigger? Was it possible? Then, one night, the unthinkable happened. Mira's movement, which had started as nothing more than whispers in the dark, became public. It wasn't a loud protest, nor was it an organized rally. No, it started with one small, quiet act that sent shockwaves through the village. Mira and the women she had gathered stood together in the marketplace just as the sun was beginning to set. They didn't shout, they didn't carry signs, they simply stood, side by side, eyes forward, and for the first time the men in the marketplace stopped to notice them. They watched as Mira, her voice trembling but strong, spoke to the crowd. She didn't ask for permission, she didn't beg for their understanding, she simply spoke the truth. "We are not invisible," she said. "We will no longer be silent. We deserve the same rights, the same respect as any man here." The crowd was silent. The air hung thick with tension, and for a moment it felt as if the entire village held its breath. Then something extraordinary happened. One by one, the men in the crowd began to speak out. They didn't shout in anger. They didn't try to dismiss Mira. Instead, they began to listen, to genuinely listen. And slowly, as the hours passed, they began to realize that Mira wasn't just speaking for herself, but for every woman in the village who had been silenced for far too long. Mira's small act of courage had sparked a revolution that was born from the quiet strength of one woman's refusal to accept things as they were. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the changes that Mira had set in motion rippled out across the village. Slowly but surely, the women began to reclaim their voices, their rights, and their futures. But this was just the beginning. The fight for equality would take time, and the road ahead would be long. But Mira's revolution, the one that began with a single woman's courage, had sparked a fire that no one could put out. The change didn't come overnight, and it certainly didn't come without resistance. In fact, as Mira's movement began to grow, so did the tension within the village. Some of the older men, those who had lived their entire lives adhering to the traditional ways, were furious. They didn't want things to change. They didn't want to face the uncomfortable truth that the system they had relied on for so long was being questioned, was being shattered. There were whispers in the dark corners of the village, accusations that Mira was causing trouble, that she was leading the women astray. Some of the men even warned their daughters and wives to stay away from her, to avoid becoming part of this dangerous movement. But the harder they tried to silence her, the louder her voice grew. The women began to see their own power reflected in one another. It wasn't just the right to speak up, it was the right to be seen, to be heard, to matter. What started as a small gathering of a few brave souls now turned into a growing community of women who were willing to risk everything for the promise of something better. But the real turning point came when a tragedy forced the entire village to face the reality of what they were living. It was a day like any other, but this day would leave a scar on the heart of the village. A young girl, just 16 years old, was brutally married off to a much older man, a practice that, although common in the village, had never sat well with the women who knew what was at stake. The girl, who had once dreamed of being a teacher, was now resigned to a life of servitude, her future stolen before she even had the chance to live it. Mira and the other women were devastated. This wasn't just a personal tragedy for the girl, but a symbol of everything that was wrong. It was the tipping point, the moment when their quiet resolve turned into uncontainable fury. The village had crossed a line. They could no longer stand by and allow such injustices to continue, not when it could so easily have been prevented. That night, Mira called an emergency gathering. Word spread quickly, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, there were more than 30 women gathered in her home. The fire in their hearts was unmistakable. This wasn't just about Mira anymore. This was about every woman who had ever been oppressed, every woman who had ever been ignored, every woman who had been told that her voice didn't matter. One by one, the women spoke of their own experiences of forced marriages, of being silenced, of being treated as lesser simply because of their gender. They spoke of the injustice they had endured for years, and in those moments a collective resolve began to take shape. The movement was no longer just a dream. It was a living, breathing force, and they were ready to take action. The very next day, they marched. They didn't wait for anyone's permission, nor did they ask for anyone's approval. The women of the village, Mira at the forefront, walked through the narrow streets, their heads held high, their steps firm. They marched through the marketplace, past the homes where the men stood with arms crossed, some watching in silent shock, others muttering in disbelief. But this time no one tried to stop them. No one threatened to send them back to their homes. The women kept walking, determined, unwavering. They made their way to the village square, where Mira stood in front of the gathered crowd. This wasn't just a protest. This was a declaration. "We will not be silenced any longer," Mira proclaimed, her voice carrying across the crowd. "We will stand for every woman who has ever been told she is not enough, for every girl who has been forced into a life she did not choose. We will stand for equality, and we will fight until our voices are heard." There was a long silence. The men in the crowd shifted uneasily, but this time something had changed. They were no longer looking at the women with disdain. Now they were looking at them with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Something was shifting in the air. Then unexpectedly a few men stepped forward. These were not the usual leaders of the village, but they were respected. Men who had quietly witnessed the change that Mira and the women had begun. They looked at each other, then back at the women. And for the first time in a long time, they spoke up. "Maybe you're right," one man said, his voice softer than usual. "Maybe it's time for us to listen." Those words were more powerful than any protest. They were a crack in the armor, the first sign that the village was changing. For the first time, Mira saw hope in their eyes. The days that followed were full of tension, but also full of promise. The village began to shift. Slowly, the women were given the chance to speak, to participate in decision-making, to take control of their own lives. Mira was approached by the village elders, those who had once tried to silence her, and they asked for her help in establishing a new set of rules for the village. Rules that would provide women with equal rights, rules that would prevent young girls from being married off before they were ready, rules that would give women the right to choose their own futures. And so a new chapter began for the village. It wasn't perfect, and there were still many battles to fight, but Mira's movement had sparked something that could not be undone. What started as a whisper in the dark had become a roar a roar that would echo through the village for generations to come. Mira had shown them all what one woman's courage could do. She had started a revolution, not with force, not with violence, but with the quiet strength of a woman who refused to accept the world as it was. In the years that followed, Mira's legacy lived on. The village became a place where women and men worked together, where equality was no longer a distant dream, but a reality. And though Mira passed on many years later, her name was still spoken with respect, with reverence. Her fight had not only changed the course of her village, but it had also inspired countless others in far-off places to rise up, to stand for what was right, and to demand change. All because one woman, who once stood in the marketplace feeling invisible, decided that enough was enough, and she was willing to fight for the future. Mira's legacy wasn't just in the laws that were changed or the new opportunities that women in the village were given. Her impact was far deeper. It was in the hearts and minds of the people she had touched. The real revolution wasn't about the battles won in the streets or the official changes written in the village records. It was about the transformation that happened in the everyday lives of the people, the way the women began to see themselves, the way the men began to understand their power and responsibility, and the way the children grew up knowing that they could be anything they wanted to be. Mira had taught them all an important lesson, that change doesn't have to come from the top down, from the rich or the powerful. It can come from the quiet courage of a single person standing firm against what is wrong. The years after the revolution were marked by a new kind of peace in the village. Yes, there were still struggles, and yes, there were still old ways of thinking that lingered, but the idea that women could fight for equality had become ingrained, and with each passing generation, the old barriers fell a little bit more. Mira had started something that couldn't be undone, not just in her village, but in the hearts of all who witnessed the change. She had sparked a fire that ignited other fires in neighboring towns, in cities far away, and even in countries beyond. Her story became a beacon of hope to women everywhere who felt they were too small to make a difference, too insignificant to challenge the systems that oppressed them. She had been a simple woman, no politician, no celebrity, but through sheer will, through an undying belief in justice and equality, she had created a wave of change that stretched far beyond the borders of her own village. But even more remarkable than the revolution she started was the way Mira had lived her life. She had never been about herself. The moment her movement grew, she stepped back, allowing others to take the stage. She believed deeply in collective power, in community. She knew that for the change to be real, it had to be bigger than any one person. It had to be about all of them working together to reshape their world. This philosophy became the foundation for a new generation. Mira had raised young women and men who were not afraid to question, not afraid to challenge, not afraid to demand what they deserved. She had empowered them to stand tall and to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made others. Mira's name was passed down from mother to daughter, from father to son, in stories that were told around firesides, in classrooms, and in village squares. And though she was no longer there to witness the full extent of her revolution, her spirit lived on in every woman who stood up for her rights, in every man who chose to support equality, and in every child who believed in the possibility of a different, more just world. Years later, on the anniversary of that first march, the women of the village, now leaders in their own right, gathered in the village square, just as they had once done, to honor Mira's memory. But this time, the square was filled with both women and men, young and old, side by side. They didn't march because they had to. They marched because they wanted to, because Mira had shown them that it was their right, and their responsibility to keep fighting for a better future. And so, in the village where Mira had once fought for the most basic of rights, a new chapter began. One not defined by division but by unity, one not marked by silence but by voices, voices that were no longer afraid to speak the truth, no longer afraid to demand change. What began as one woman's fight for equality had sparked a revolution that had transformed an entire village. And from that village, the ripples of change spread out, touching lives in ways Mira could never have imagined, creating a legacy that would inspire generations to come. In the end, Mira's greatest victory was not the changes she had fought for, it was the hope she had ignited in others. The hope that no matter where we come from, no matter how small we feel, we have the power to create change, and all it takes is one person, one moment, one fight for equality to start a revolution. Her story is a reminder that in the face of injustice, when the odds are stacked against us, the power of a single voice can be enough to turn the tide. And that when we stand together in the fight for what is right, there is no force more unstoppable than the will to create a better, fairer world. Mira's revolution, in the end, was not just for her village or for women, but for all of humanity. Because the fight for equality is the fight for every person, every voice, every life, and when we stand together, nothing can hold us back. As time passed, the village that once seemed to be stuck in its old ways became a symbol of progress, a living testament to the power of unity, determination, and change. Mira's village was no longer defined by the divisions that had once been so deeply entrenched. It was a place where the balance of power had shifted, where everyone had a seat at the table, where decisions were made collectively, not by the few, but by the many. But while Mira's revolution had made strides, the world beyond her village was still a battleground. Her story, though powerful, was not an isolated case. Across the world, in villages, towns, and cities, there were still millions of women and men fighting for equality, fighting for the right to be heard, to be seen, to be respected. Mira's movement had sparked something much larger than herself, and her name had become a rallying cry for the ongoing global fight for justice. Her story inspired activists and leaders far beyond her village's borders. Young women in urban centers, women from cultures that had been even more deeply rooted in patriarchy, found inspiration in Mira's determination. Her courage fueled their own, and they began their own movements, sometimes in the most unlikely of places. There were protests in crowded cities where women fought against being denied education, against early marriages, against violence and discrimination. And all over the world, women like Mira were standing tall, refusing to accept the status quo, standing together to demand the changes they knew the world so desperately needed. But Mira never set out to become an icon. She never envisioned her fight as one that would change the world on such a grand scale. She simply wanted a better life for herself and the women of her village. And in doing so, she set in motion a movement that transcended borders, that became a part of the global conversation about equality and justice. Her humility, her quiet strength, and her unwavering belief in the power of collective action had become a beacon of hope for those who, like her, had once felt powerless. And in every corner of the world, women found courage in her story. In the years that followed, Mira's village continued to evolve. It became a hub for activists and community leaders who wanted to learn from its transformation. Young people from all over came to witness the change, to see for themselves how one woman's fight could reshape an entire community. As Mira's story spread, so did the seeds of transformation. What began in a small village grew into a movement that sought to level the playing field for women everywhere. Mira's revolution had sparked something that couldn't be put back into the box. It had ignited a fire in the hearts of millions, a fire that no government, no institution, and no amount of resistance could extinguish. And even though Mira was no longer there to witness the full scope of her impact, the world she left behind was a better place. Her legacy lived on in the lives of the women who had followed her, in the children who were born into a world of opportunity, in the men who stood beside them as equal partners in the fight for justice. The village where Mira had fought for equality became a symbol of what was possible when individuals stood up against the odds, when they refused to accept a world that didn't value their worth. It was a reminder that revolution doesn't always come with the sound of marching feet or the flash of a protest sign. Sometimes the quietest revolution, one that begins in the hearts of a few, can change the course of history. Mira had changed the world, but not in the way anyone expected. She didn't lead an army, she didn't conquer lands. She simply stood up for what was right, for what she knew was just. And in doing so, she had created something far more powerful than any war. She had created a movement that would continue for generations, a movement that would never stop fighting for equality. Her fight was not just for women or for her village, it was for humanity. It was a fight for the belief that no one should be made to feel lesser than, no matter their gender, race, or status. It was a fight for the idea that every human being deserves the same opportunities, the same rights, the same respect. And now, as the world continues to face challenges, as new battles for justice are fought on every front, Mira's revolution serves as a reminder of the strength that lies in one person's resolve. In the face of adversity, when it seems like the world is set against us, the courage of one person standing up for what is right can create a ripple that changes everything. Her legacy lives on in the many voices, the many leaders, the many movements that carry the torch she lit. The struggle for equality continues, but it is a struggle now driven by the spirit of those like Mira, those who refused to back down, who refused to accept that the world could not be made better. As long as her story is told, Mira's revolution will never die. It will continue to inspire, to ignite change, and to show the world that no matter how small the spark, no matter how quiet the voice, one person can start a fire that changes everything. In the end, that is the power of hope, the power to believe, even in the darkest of times, that we can make the world a better place. One voice, one fight, one person at a time. Mira's story, though it began with her alone, became a collective story. A story of everyone who fought with her, for her, and those who came after her, carrying her vision forward. Her life was the embodiment of a powerful truth that every person, regardless of their background, has the ability to ignite change. Her village became a place of learning, growth, and possibility. The seeds of equality once sown began to bloom in unexpected ways. Young girls who had once been told their voices didn't matter now spoke in boardrooms, in classrooms, and in community meetings. The men, too, who had once seen equality as a threat, became the most ardent allies in the fight. They understood through Mira's influence that true progress could only come when everyone was given an equal stake in the world's future. It wasn't always easy, and it didn't happen overnight. The road to equality was never a straight line. There were setbacks, there were moments of doubt, but the revolution had been set in motion, and nothing could stop it now. Mira had given the world a new way to see justice, not as an abstract ideal, but as something real, something tangible, something worth fighting for. And so her story continued to inspire new generations to rise up, to speak out, and to demand change. Each time a new leader emerged in the global fight for equality, Mira's name was whispered. Her story was a touchstone, a source of strength. It reminded people everywhere that they, too, could change the world. And with that belief, they did. As years passed, Mira's village became a global symbol of resistance, resilience, and hope. It wasn't just a village anymore, it was a living example of what was possible when ordinary people, united by a common cause, took control of their destiny. They had proven that the greatest revolutions often don't come from armies, but from the hearts of the people. And even though Mira had passed on, she was never truly gone. Her story lived on in the children who had been raised in her spirit, in the women who followed her path, and in the men who had come to see equality not as a threat, but as a necessary part of humanity's progress. Her legacy was not built on laws alone, but on a change of heart. It was in the courage to speak the truth, to fight for justice, and to believe, even when the world seemed stacked against you, that change was possible. Her story was the proof that a single voice, no matter how small, could reverberate across time and space, creating a ripple effect that could shake the very foundations of society. In the end, Mira's fight wasn't just for equality, it was for the very soul of humanity. It was for the belief that we all deserve to live with dignity, with respect, with fairness. And through her relentless pursuit of justice, she had created a world where that dream was closer to becoming a reality for all. The revolution she started didn't end with her. It never could. Because the fight for equality isn't just a chapter in history, it's an ongoing movement. And as long as there are those willing to take up the cause, as long as there are those who still believe in justice, the revolution will continue. And so, Mira's legacy lives on in every person who fights for what is right, in every person who stands against injustice, in every person who believes that one voice, no matter how small, can change the world. The story of Mira, the woman who fought for equality and sparked a revolution, is a reminder to us all. No matter where we come from, no matter what we face, we all have the power to make a difference. It only takes one person to start a revolution. And it is that spirit, that belief in the power of one, that will continue to shape the world for generations to come.